Welcome to another Sunday Supplement Live. So this week's I called Tax, Investment and Efficiency, but I'm sure it'll be more exciting than it sounds, so don't worry. Now, as you'll know, I like to start each week with a quote, and this week's was, "The biggest risk of all is not taking one," and that's from Melody Hobson, American businesswoman and chair of Starbucks. Of course, it's been stolen and misappropriated many times, but apparently it was Melody that first said it. So, before we get started, I just want to take a little bit of your time to outline what happens in the boardroom club that I run alongside Rod Turner, that we've been running for about 4.5 years now. It's a group set up to help take property businesses to the next level. Rod and I often get asked about one-to-one mentoring, and it isn't something that we provide or have the appetite or the time to provide in the near future. However, there is a one-to-one element to the club, and it does include the following: a 2 to 3 hour deep dive planning session just with Rod and myself. Goes all the way through any existing plans you have in your entire business and group, breaks it down in a constructive way and builds it back up again. From visions and missions all the way to the nuts and bolts and what you need to focus on every day in order to be more successful. Then there's a monthly session with the other businesses that are part of the club, with an individual slot where Rod and I act as your non-exec directors, and the group also offer their observations, thoughts and support. This is delivered on Zoom, apart from 3 days a year where we meet in person. We then have a monthly one-to-one call each month with either Rod and myself on an alternating basis for 30 to 45 minutes as required. And you also have a private WhatsApp group with Rod and myself if you need support in between or help on a quick decision. Our service level agreement is to reply within 24 hours, but of course we aim to beat that. We just need everybody to understand we're not just sitting there waiting to reply to people's WhatsApps. So if you're interested in joining, please drop Rod or myself a message on LinkedIn. So that's Rod Turner on LinkedIn, or Adam Lawrence on LinkedIn. And thanks for listening. So, what a week we had with negotiations left, right and centre on ticket sizes from 1 units to up to 60 units and a fair few in between. We secured more properties as the budget fears reached fever pitch. Few are realistic, of course, on the portfolio front, but the occasional one is, which is good news. The key remains motivation. What's the reason for the sale? If people are being coy or playing hard to get, there's just no room for that at the moment. Follow up after the 30th of October. Chris Watkin has had a week off the broader market insights this week, which of course we forgive him for, given that he pumps out the content on a damn nearly weekly basis all the time. So we get straight into the macro this week, and there's plenty to go at. The Halifax House Price Index, the RICS UK Residential Market Survey, the growth figures in the UK economy, and there's plenty more, but of course we're contractually obliged, or more likely completely fascinated by, the gilts and the swaps to round us off. So the Halifax, much maligned, usually by me to be honest, their -4% prediction for 2024's UK property market is now 8.7% adrift, as they print plus 4.7% for the last 12 months and are up 0.3% on the month, 1.2% on the quarter. They blame weak base effects, but presumably they knew what the base effects would be 11 months ago when they made their predictions, but there we go. Their price index is £108 short of the all-time high on the Halifax index of June 2022, which was £293,507. It's fair to say that the last 2+ years have been spent recovering lost ground. I'd absolutely agree with that. They're now predicting modest growth over the rest of this year and into the next. They don't really define modest. Perhaps they're learning their lesson. The consensus was 0.2% growth, and so the forecasts were very nearly right for a change. September's reversion mortgage rate, so that's the average lender SVR, was down 14 basis points, still to an eye-watering 7.69%. I'm sure you'll agree. So, the RICS UK Residential Market Survey then. They lead with the headline, "Sales market activity continues to display a more positive trend." New buyer index remains in positive territory. Sales and new listings display stronger momentum. House prices rising at the aggregate level. It's been incredible to watch this year as the market has climbed in spite of a largely bearish RICS survey report month on month. Of late, they've started to recognise that they see prices rising over the next 12 months when they've been rising in the background over the past 12 months. Remember, the survey looks at balance. So if 100 RICS respondents respond to the survey and 60 say things are improving and 40 say things are getting worse, the balance score is plus 20, 60 minus 40. Similarly, if 50 say things are improving, 30 say things are getting worse, and 20 say things are staying the same, the balance score is still plus 20. So that's one of the inherent flaws with this type of scoring methodology, but there we go. New buyer inquiries for September scored at plus 14. Agreed sales were at plus 5 after a plus 6 last month. Plus 23 expect increased sales volumes over the next 3 months, which, bearing in mind those 3 months are the last quarter of the year, which are not notorious for sales volumes, it's a very bullish reading indeed, actually. Now, the year ahead is now posting plus 44, so you can see a very strong upwards trend coming, according to the RICS. The RICS members, as a rule, are very cautious. They'll only come to a party once it's well underway. However, there's no doubt at plus 44 they're well on the bus right now. The rise in new instructions was a strong plus 22 for September. The average number of properties available per branch, per estate agency branch that has an RICS qualification, was 44.6, which is the highest stock availability number since December 2020. The headline figure, the one from the survey that tends to be reported, printed plus 11. That's the net balance. August was 0. July was minus 16. So this is the indication that prices are indeed, according to the majority of the RICS members now, on the rise. Like I said, a bit slow to the party. This ends a run since October 22 when, okay, I'll leave it for this week, but of negative or zero readings on the overall RICS house price balance. Over the next 12 months, those who think prices will increase printed plus 54. This is extremely strong, the strongest since April 2022. Finally, there can be no more denial as to what I've been saying for well over a year. Houses, as much as everyone wants to decry the prices, mostly because they don't understand inflation, are actually pretty darn cheap in real terms right now. If you think you've seen a tear up in the past, and if you believe the people can't afford them rhetoric, buckle up because your mind is about to be changed. Just know one thing, I'm not the sort of person to say I told you so, except I am. Tenant demand next, a plus 22 reading. It keeps going up and up. The plus 38 in 2023 was higher, but this is demand up from previous months, not compared to where demand was a year ago. It just keeps rising at a slower rate, which is probably a good thing given how badly undersupplied the market is currently. Affordability, in my view, remains the only governor of rents right now. Landlord instructions on the supply side, minus 29 and continually slipping. Plus 39 see rental prices moving up over the next 3 months. Then there are some interesting graphs always shared within the report which are worth commenting on. Expected average annual change in prices over the next 5 years, just under 4% per year. Expected average annual change in rents over the next 5 years, just over 5% per year. So that would mean yields would continue to improve, although they'd be improving a lot more slowly than they have been. If you were going to use a number in your models, the relative bearishness of the RICS should really give you quite a lot of confidence in using these numbers nationwide. If you wanted the data regionally, you'd have to pay for the report, or at least scour Google very hard. So, over to growth and back to growth. Well, I'll start with NISA, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, and their real-time GDP tracker. They forecast 0.2% growth rate for Q3 of 2024. The ONS figures are that August was a growth of 0.2% month on month, but the last couple of months have been flat. So the expectation is also, it seems, for a flattish September as far as NISA are concerned. Similarly, as already reported, growth was revised down from Q2 from 0.6 to 0.5 by the ONS, and the last 12 months have now shown growth of 1% in GDP in real terms. Although since the start of the year, we're now up nearly 1.5. So it seems we won't reach my stretch prediction of 2%, thanks to the recent negative rhetoric and complete inconsistency from the new government, saying they want growth and then making noises that are completely anti-growth, leaving businesses and individuals with no confidence. Still, I don't see GDP growth in the UK under 1.5 for this year, in spite of their best efforts to mess everything up. Remember that between August and December 2023, things contracted a reasonable amount, 0.4% or so. And that's why we're up 1.1% year on year, but 1.5% for the calendar year, if that makes sense. So a recap of the tale of the tape this year: surprise growth, outperformance, but really simply bounce back and dragged forward by a massive drop in inflation. Because remember, GDP is measured in real terms, it's adjusted for inflation. That was Q1, and Q2 was decent, but it was knocked off its perch by the election and the uncertainty in June. July was also flat as the country worked out what was going on in the new government, even though there was hope. August was up as we kept calm and carried on, because we are British, after all. Then things started to unravel in real time as it became clear, at the most charitable, that this new government hasn't got a bloody clue what they're doing. To an extent, of course they haven't. None of them have done it for at least 14 years, and most of them were not MPs 14 years ago. The moral high ground hasn't helped, just like stories coming out of the Treasury at the moment that Rachel Reeves is checkmated every way she turns, let alone Freebie Gate or whatever you want to call it. The optics are bad and the popularity ratings have plummeted. The others, of course, excuse me, got kicked out rightly for the complete mess that was the last 5 years. My view is still that the losers, i.e. primarily Sunak and Hunt, didn't do a terrible job. Sunak was a weak leader, but he was far from clueless. Hunt played the game, although I would like to have seen him be much bolder, but let's remember he was a night watchman after a man who would have simply been better off being replaced by a random number generator or a tub of lard, or simply no one at all doing the job. So to an extent, Jeremy Hunt's hands were tied, although I think Hunt was probably always that guy, whether he'd followed Kwasi Kwarteng or not. So, right now we're simply left with the two buttocks from the same behind argument. They're all at it, etc., etc. This is all a distraction, and their competency matters significantly. The NISA forecast of 0.2% growth for Q3 really means we expect another zero print in September as we play a waiting game for this horrific budget, which certainly won't be as bad as everyone thinks. October could see a contraction, of course, if business really stops and waits. However, if you talk to professional services firms, they're busy because exit activity has been generated, which should move services GDP onwards, to be honest. Then think of all the leaving parties for the ultranets leaving the UK because they've had enough of paying tax. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the deep dive. So how did we get to 0.2% for August? Services up 0.1, still a bit limp after the election, and there'll be an element of August being August, of course. Weather was also disappointing, as we know, and that will have impacted August spending. Production was up 0.5% and construction up by 0.4, both looking healthy, making the services 0.1 into a 0.2 for the whole economy, due to the weighting between services, production and construction. So, just as the reduction in inflation helped massively in Q1 and to a lesser extent in Q2, the rise back upwards, even though it's so far been small, October's number might not be great depending on what happens to oil, but we know we had 10% on household utility bills on October the 1st. That won't help the real GDP figures and will act as a bit of a suppressant rather than an accelerant as it did early this year. So there's not much to learn from the minutiae of services and production. However, I will dwell briefly on construction. A 1% increase in the 3 months to August 2024 is in line with the very positive construction PMIs that I've been reporting on for several months. Good news in the sector, although mostly not concentrated in residential house building, specifically civils and commercial works. Infrastructure new work up 2.7% in that 3-month period. Non-housing maintenance and repair up 5.6%. Only in August, rather than the quarter as a whole, did things start to move in private new housing, up by 3.4% after a long lag. But the PMI still suggests it's the laggard of the three subsectors in construction, though. There are also quite a few more revisions in this month's data. GDP revised by 0.1% upwards in March this year, 0.1% downwards for April, and 0.2% downwards for May. That's what trimmed the Q2 growth from 0.6 to 0.5. That doesn't look like it adds up, maybe, but there are generally rounding errors, so 0.2 might mean 0.16 to 0.2, etc., etc. So we accept the 0.2 with open arms. Elections mean disruption, ultimately. As it goes, and as it turns out, budgets actually mean more disruptions than elections when you speak very naively and bearishly to all the main actors in the economy months before delivering one. And then you backpedal furiously, but nobody wants to listen. So, in conclusion, I'm much more bearish on growth than I was, perhaps 0.5% adrift of my most hopeful prediction for 2024 at any point. Still, far, far closer than the idiots who were forecasting 0.5% growth for the year when Q1 had already shown a 0.7% growth. I still can't get my head around why they get paid for forecasting such utter tripe. The yields then, or the subject I prefer to avoid at the moment. Since we dipped under 3.5% around a month ago on the 5 year, which was a triumphant and happy day, things have gone wonky. So a quick word on why. The international bond markets don't yet trust Rachel Reeves. The feeling behind the scenes, ethereally, that no single voice elucidates, but you can just read in the air, is that she might spend big, meaning a bigger black hole than she's already alluded to. I'll go further. It's actually a huge mistake if she doesn't. My view is that she will do this and will deliver it with some element of confidence and skill by changing the fiscal rules, or at least interpreting them differently. Let's be clear. The budget speech in March 2020 were analysed at the time. I can't really justify going back now and line by lining it because I don't believe it's a good use of everybody's time. But my sense of it is this. It was a mess because there was a draft speech of what Johnson and Sunak wanted to do, and then it all had to be amended, but half of it was left in. And it was amended because of the pandemic and all of that becoming very clear in terms of what was happening in Europe at the time. It was delivered on the 11th of March 2020, for context, so 10 days before the first lockdown. One of the key promises it included, following on from a manifesto that no one read, because you either voted for the buffoon with the great hair or against the neo-communist Jeremy Corbyn, or of course some voted with Corbyn. But the promise was a massive spend on infrastructure, £640 billion. Here's the relevant quote from the bit that was drafted before the pandemic really hit. By the end of the Parliament, public sector net investment will be triple the average over the last 40 years in real terms. In total, around 640 billion of gross capital investment will be provided for roads, railways, communications, schools, hospitals and power networks across the UK by 2024 to 25. Oops, I think might be the appropriate line. Now listen, I hear you say, there was a pandemic, mate. The issue though, is that we could have borrowed that 640 billion at nearly no interest rate at all in 2021. If we timed it brilliantly, we could almost have been paid to borrow it. Yes, really, because longer yields went negative. Make no mistake, if we'd borrowed 640 billion, the yield premium would have moved up. But if we'd shown an investment case, and it's not hard to show an investment case when you're paying 1% or less on the debt, which we would have been, we would have got the money. We could have had 50-year bonds. We could have even had 100-year bonds. Plenty of countries at the time did have the vision to do this, a truly intergenerational opportunity. Ideology stopped them. Now, I'm the first to slam the ideology of the left when it is utterly nonsensical. Rent controls would be the easiest example. I'm not politically wired and I have no issue slamming the ideology of the right when it is wrong-headed as well. Austerity was essential after 2010. The way it was enacted was damaging, unhelpful, anti-growth and misguided. Not spending the money to enact the best plans that Johnson ever had was a gigantic opportunity missed. If we now carry on with those mistakes, that would be an intergalactic error. Instead now, Rachel Reeves is going to struggle to get 50 billion rather than 13 times that. And there's been a fair bit of inflation since then, as you know, and she's going to have to pay a higher rate of interest on the debt. So, UK infrastructure investment is so woefully behind other developed nations compared to where we were 30 years ago. The UK is bottom of the G7 league for investment, that's overall, not just infrastructure, for 24 of the last 30 years. That is an utter embarrassment, and we cannot go on like that. You can see that time period covers basically 50-50 between the blues and the reds. So just like in housing, they're both as bad as each other. Reeves has got a simple problem. She needs to do what she said she's going to do, and we need real growth policies. So that's a long segue back to the yields, but hopefully a worthwhile one. We breached that psychological barrier of 4% again on the 5-year gilt, which is too high in my view. Opening at 4.052 on the week, we closed at 4.071. So we've drifted nearly 60 basis points the wrong way in a month. Yahoo sucks is the most technical analysis I can come up with. Thursday's close on the gilt was 4.084, and the swaps continued at what can only be described as a chasm below the gilt, happily. The 30-ish basis point discount that has emerged has been preserved. Fantastic news, to be honest. It's still up 20 basis points on last week, though. 3.796 was Thursday's close on the 5-year SONIA swap. That leaves our 5-year money at about 5.8%. And I'd like to add to this section, that leaves our investment grade rental yield at about 8.3%. Where do I get that number from? Well, I allow for 30% costs of management and maintenance on a property, including insurances and things like that. Does that look high to you? Does that look safe? Well, remember a couple of weeks back, I talked at length about Peabody Housing Association, who shared that they nearly spend 80% of their rents on maintenance and management of their properties. Their rents average £137 per week, £594 a month. And so maintenance and management is costing them £475 per month per unit. Now that looks insane, and it shows you how much more efficient the private sector is than the social sector. Sorry, folks. No one reading this, I don't think, will be needing to spend £475 per month per unit on their properties. However, let's have a pop at doing the exercise properly. A roof with a lifespan of 80 years today might cost about 7k for a replacement. Windows and external doors, a lifespan of 50 years, total cost of 5k. Fascias and soffits, 40 years, 2.5k. Wiring, 5k for a including a redecoration, 40-year lifespan. Bathroom, total cost 4k today, 25-year lifespan. Kitchen, 25-year lifespan, today's cost 5k. Flooring, 2k cost today, 12-year lifespan. Decoration, 6-year lifespan, today's cost 2.5k. Boiler, 15-year lifespan, today's cost 2.5k. And then what about other structural contributions, issues, pointing, damp works, plastering? When you add in things like needing positive input ventilation systems and any other progress that will be made in trying to ensure people don't live in damp properties, especially if they won't necessarily open their windows or stop drying their clothes on radiators. So let's say £150 a year reserve fund for other stuff not captured in all of that. Now look, I'm making those numbers up. They're educated guesses really. It's not data I've got on my fingertips. If anyone does have that level of data for a portfolio, please get in touch because I'd love to have it. But you can see my logic. Remember, that's just maintenance. That's not compliance. It's not insurance and all the rest of it. If you amortise that lot, you come out at £1,635 per year or £136.25 per month. Management market rate wise, according to Arla, would come in at 12% plus VAT. But the lightest bit of negotiation will get you 10% plus VAT from most agents, and even lower than that if you've got some real volume. So let's say your average rent is 1.5 times Peabody's, let's say 900 per month. 136.25 per unit, based on the lifespan of everything that I've said. Let's provision another £40 for bits that come up, leaky taps, etc., etc. They don't need full replacements, but they're in there. £108 on management fees, £40 a month on insurance, compliance amortised per year, EICRs with upgrades, gas safe with upgrades, etc. Our average EICR on older stock that we buy tends to come back with about £800 of work, then less as time goes on as a rule. So let's be cautious. £17 a month allowance for EICR. Let's put in £20 for a boiler cover policy. If you want to build a reserve between now and 2030 for £10,000 worth of works, which is the best guess, that might be sensible. Based on EPCs, we'd need to put in another £140 a month. Now, reserve is only sensible business provisioning anyway, but of course if your EPC is already C, you don't need it. But we know that the average rental isn't. So that would be £501.25 a month. So maybe take Peabody. Peabody aren't getting it wrong, although take out my reserve for EPC and we come back down to £361.25. So about £100 better than Peabody, realistically. As rent goes down, the management fee goes down, but the rest remains the same. That number works out as 40% of rent at £900, not 30%. But my number, even over recent years with age stock, on the basis that we get our works done, we don't put them off, is 30%, not 40%. We're beating some of those prices I gave you, of course, because we do have volume and we have some other edges as well. Our average rent in the UK is higher than £900, but you can see why my 30% figure looks about right. And that's where my investment grade yield comes from. If a unit isn't investment grade, then when it comes up for remortgage, or ideally before, you need to think about what you're going to be doing with it, in my view. All options are on the table. Active asset management, sweating the asset harder, disposing of the asset. So rather than my 8.3, the average number being touted around at the moment is more like 7.5. Now, of course, not everyone will be leveraged to 75%. The average mortgaged landlord is mortgaged to about 63% LTV as it goes. But only 50 to 60% of landlords are mortgaged, depending on which numbers you trust. The other 40 to 50% are unencumbered. There's a ton of stock under that 7.5% yield, particularly as you get further south and east, of course. Anyway, a little segue to give a little more insight that I want to try and keep in on a weekly basis. Seems like a good addition to the constant sweat of gilt and swap yields. Okay, let's get the waders on. The budget is coming up, and my goodness, it has led to a flurry of activity. I spend no time per day at all worrying about how my tax position will change. I'm a price taker. We all are in this market. So I spend more time making money and worrying less. The old school attitude of if I pay £1 million tax a year, it's a wonderful problem to have, drives me forward. With a growth strategy, tax is the least of your problems anyway, to be honest. Cash flow's a different matter. Rachel's had a bit of a lesson this week and even reminders from The Guardian. Norway, here we come. Now, we love Scandinavian lesson, don't we? Especially if we reside somewhere near the left. They have a wealth tax. They're also minted anyway, as you'll know, thanks to their gigantic sovereign wealth fund, as they invested their oil surpluses, where we decided to repatriate them in real time with a massive welfare state, the NHS, etc., etc. It's a choice. That's the choice we made versus the choice they made. The counter to that, of course, is they also suffer much higher income taxes in percentage terms, so their public services were also sufficiently funded in the first place. The wealth tax is on people that aren't really that wealthy at all. And remember, that's how tax works. Several hundred years ago, tax was introduced on the rich. Nowadays, the meaningful tax, the vast majority, is paid by the top 80 to 90% in society, not the top 0.8 to 0.9 as it was first pitched. Income tax on everything above 12,570 quid. VAT on basically everything. Yes, there are some exceptions. Want to raise big money? You have to do it on income tax or VAT on the masses. Yeah, the top 1% pay 30% of the income tax. That's a lot, and it doesn't feel like there's a lot more to go before you're shearing the sheep one too many times. I'm not sure what percentage of the VAT they pay or whether that data is even available. That's the end of the debate. The rest of these black holes are smoke and mirrors. So Norway, anyway. The wealth tax has existed since 1892. Scandalous, you say, but then for the past 10 years, there's been no inheritance tax. So pay it while you're around, but die safely in Norway in the knowledge of assets passing on. As so often with international comparisons, it's complicated. Wealth tax is paid on net assets above 125k. Personally, you'd think people would be getting loans so they could reduce their net wealth to 124,999, wouldn't you? And I'm sure some people do. They moved from 0.85% on that net wealth, on that relatively low threshold, to 1.1% on wealth above 1.6 million, which feels quite a lot more like wealth, doesn't it? The 1.1% rate was the same rate as it was in 2013, but this move led to a flight of the billionaires. So the actual numbers were, they were hoping to raise an extra 400 million. They actually suffered a loss in tax receipts of 500 million. So nearly £1 billion worth of loss. It's complicated as well because a lot of this flight included moving to Switzerland, which has got a more aggressive wealth tax of its own. So what's going on there? Well, when you drill down, it's CGT, capital gains tax. The written rule really is that as a country, you either have CGT or you have wealth tax. And CGT is inherently linked to inheritance tax because IHT is a little bit like CGT after death, right? CGT dies on death, but the crystallisation event is death and then it becomes IHT. So any tax specialist listening, please be kind. I know I'm not a chartered tax advisor, nor am I trying to be one. But it's always been a bit naughty. They do have CGT and they have had since 2006. They also had a form of exit tax which has been proposed for the UK and actually does effectively already exist because you need to repatriate for 5 years, although you don't have to wait for 5 years to do the sale that avoids the CGT. It's just that the tax becomes due if you become UK resident again within the 5 years. That exit tax has now been changed. It now applies indefinitely in Norway since November 2022 and is at an enhanced rate of CGT, 37.84% on the sale of shares. Ouch. So what happened? Well, a lot of people legged it before the 29th of November 2022 on that basis because it was the day that the tax changed. There's more sensible solutions here than just taxing the wealthy out of the country. Norway lost this £500 million in tax revenue instead of raising nearly £500 million, as I said earlier on. Canada allows assets to be rebased on arrival, a little bit like incorporation relief, if you understand how that works. If you have properties you paid £1 million for many years ago that are now worth £5 million, and they're in your personal name, and if you could incorporate, you can rebase those assets at £5 million within the company. You could then sell them and not incur corporation tax. Now, the capital gain isn't lost, but it's kicked out into the shares, so it washes through, if you like. Another alternative is when you announce a change, you do it that way. Norway gave people a heads up, and so they fired off abroad. So you have to do it on that day to make sure you imprison people, which is, let's face it, a little bit draconian. No notice, you can't leave. Tax hostages, I'd probably use the phrase. Very aggressive. The issue then was tax policy being complex and overlapping to a large extent, but it was a real terms example of what happens if you try to squeeze the lemons too hard. They pay plenty. Whether they pay the right deemed percentage, mostly based on uncrystallised gains, is the wrong question. How much tax are they paying? That's the right question. So there's this inherent idea that the percentage taxation system is fair. Why? Just paying more and more and more from a percentage point of view, even as you pay more and more tax, just isn't fair, is it, ultimately? And this is what Italy have been capitalising on by tempting people to move to Italy with a flat rate of tax for high net individuals. So they aren't paying percentages anymore. They're still just making a pretty massive contribution, paying well above what they cost. And of course, they will still pay sales tax and things like that if they're living in Italy. So there's numbers up to about 25% from what I see, perhaps even up to 30%, that most people will pay happily enough. Everyone's different, of course, but we need to maximise the tax take. That should be the job of the government, maximise it. Personally, I'll be looking at big tech to foot some of the bill, as they underpay tax drastically compared to their societal costs. We do nothing, talk far too little about the externalities, as we economists like to call them, in terms of the scars on mental health aside from anything else. They need hardcore regulation with teeth, fast, or a tax stick to beat them with, or both. Tax them on turnover, not the landlords. I'd also get stuck into big food. No, I don't mean eating it. The sugar tax was a magnificent success that needs further rollout. Be done with it. Put income tax back to 32% or 30% where it should be at the basic rate. Scrap employees' national insurance. Don't make the workers subsidise everybody else. If you have income above 12,570 quid, pay the tax. Much more effective. But of course, Rachel Reeves can't, because she's painted herself into this stupid corner because the entire party was so scared of saying what they already knew before they got into power. Jeremy Hunt had pared down and fired every bullet he had in his chamber to either try and keep the Tories in power or shaft Labour if they did win. And this is why I can never be political, because I'm too honest. We all knew that before, we knew it at the election, and we know it now. If we didn't, we weren't paying attention, quite frankly. So, Rachel, there you go. Change the rules with the blessing of the supplement and many other economists far more preeminent than myself. Explain it well and we'll be fine. We know you aren't Liz Truss. We're worried that the infrastructure spends will spiral out of control, of course. Remember, the average government project, major project, goes 75% over budget and 67% over time, and that's regardless of the colour of the government in power. But we desperately, desperately need investment. So before I close this section, one more shout out that is positive. One more decent chess piece on the board. Starmer has appointed Poppy Gustafsson OBE as Minister for Investment. Let's get the context right. The International Investment Summit on Monday the 14th is a great idea at a bloody ridiculous time. 2 weeks before the budget, it just makes them look naive and stupid. However, it's a regular thing, and perhaps they can get it right next year. We can always hope. All the headlines thus far was about not inviting Elon Musk, which is also stupid. He's been a right idiot himself about the UK in recent times, but we all know that he spews nonsense for clicks. Ultimately, that's his new business, even if he has blown off about $30 to $35 billion worth of value so far on X, because the brand is now toxic as far as mainstream large cap companies are concerned for advertising purposes. He probably wouldn't have come, but with potential projects such as gigafactories in Bridgewater, be the bigger person, Kier, for goodness sakes. Forget Elon anyway, we all know he's as mad as a box of frogs. Back to Poppy, the ex-CEO of Darktrace, from startup at CFO level to then COO and then CEO and a successful listing on the stock exchange. Her track record is magnificent and without question. This looks even more inspired than James Timpson, but it's risky. If she or he gets fed up because of the BS of the political system or the civil service, are they going to stick it out? This is public service at the absolute highest level, and Starmer ends up with egg on his face. I'm not sure there's any more room for any more eggs at this time, but there we go. Anyway, I'm going to be positive about it. These are absolutely the sort of people UK PLC need at the very top level. I hope they Poppy and James Timpson the respect they have both earned and both deserve. Fingers crossed, because we need something to sort this woeful underinvestment situation out. Okay, before I close for the week, I wanted to look at the ONS release from this week about energy efficiency in England and Wales on housing. This is an annual report and will be informing Mr Miliband, if he takes information on board, I'm not convinced that he does, and Parliament about what progress has been made and is being made or not. So, here's the tail of the tape. The median EPC scores on live EPC, so up to 10 years old, is 68 in England and 67 in Wales. A C starts at 69, but this is a classic example of an arbitrary scale. Is a 68 or a 67 horrifically worse than a 69? Of course not. These are largely clumped at the median level. The London median score is 70. The West Midlands and Yorkshire do the worst regionally at 67. New dwellings have got a median score of 84 in the past 5 years. This is compared to 82 in England and 81 in Wales in the 5 years leading up to 2013. 73% of new dwellings in London in the past 5 years had community heating systems as their main fuel type. I found that interesting because some mortgage lenders don't like them very much, although they're more comfortable with them in London than they are in other parts of the country. Now, we're going to end up working towards the nonsense of some kind of arbitrary cliff edge between C's and D's as a rule. If the scoring system was moved down by 5 points, and one way or another, however this is fixed, that's absolutely one of the outcomes I expect at some point, there are so many more properties would pass the requirements. Here's another interesting piece of detail. Flats and maisonettes are the most efficient, one of the reasons why London measures up, if not the reason. The median score for a flat is 73. Then social rent comes next. 70 in England, 72 in Wales. Then PRS stock, 67 in England, 65 in Wales. And then at the bottom, owner-occupied homes, 2/3 of the stock, remember, coming at 65 England and 63 Wales. Right? A couple of other interesting tidbits. Heating in new dwellings. Outside of London, increasing proportions of new dwellings have gas as their main fuel type, comparing 08 to 13 to 19 to 24. So much for phasing out gas boilers, eh? The ONS claim this may be down to better recording of fuel types. Now, I think the situation is likely a bit worse than this, because owner-occupiers invest less in energy efficiency than landlords of all types. That much seems clear from the data. Not loads less, but less. However, only 69% in England and 66% in Wales have had at least one EPC registration since 2007 when the records began. The other 31 to 34%, you can pretty much guarantee, aren't going to be more energy efficient. They haven't been rented or sold in that 17-year period. They're likely owned by older owners. Definitionally, they're 17 years older than a first-time buyer, on average, for example, and they're more likely to be less energy efficient. Plus, it also means we don't even know how efficient or not 1/3 of our stock is. Houses built before 1930 have a 60% coverage of EPCs in England and a 57% coverage in Wales, and we know they're going to be more energy inefficient. So, we aren't as far off at the median as we might otherwise be. The tweak of the scoring system that's coming after consultation, or the complete rip-up and introduction of the home energy model, which I can't find a single reference to from Ed Miliband just yet, will have the desire to get more strict, but I wouldn't be surprised if they had to game the system somewhat. The bulk of the problem ultimately is getting owner-occupiers to invest in energy efficiency. Let's face it, Labour was somewhat sensible about solar last time they were in power. Perhaps they'll make some decent decisions on that front. We live in hope. So one more little segue before I go. I wanted to say a thank you to Danny Inman and his Prosperity Network. I enjoyed a great day on Friday last week delivering a mastermind session to his experienced and engaged audience up in Warrington, or the Chelsea of the North, as he prefers. Over the years, I've been kept at significant arm's length from some of the networking organisations who've struggled to get their heads around the what, where and why of Partners in Property and Propenomix. Danny's been much more open-minded, and I'm looking forward to future collaborations between Partners in Property and Prosperity. If you aren't already following Danny on the socials, you should. He talks a lot of sense and he sells no smoke whatsoever. It's all substance. So Danny, Pip and Prosperity, thanks for welcoming me so warmly. And before I go, make sure you save the date for our next property business workshop, Thursday, January the 16th, 2025. I can't believe it. Some great subject matter: planning, efficiencies, financial accounting and bookkeeping. So it's not how to use Xero, but how do you ensure your reporting is set up correctly? How do you monitor it on an effective ongoing monthly basis? There's only one way to deal with all of this ongoing noise and excitement. Keep calm, always read or listen to the supplement, and carry on. Thanks everyone.